A millionaire goes to pick up his daughter from school and discovers that she has been suffering bullying for being black. Then he takes an emotional action that leaves everyone in tears. Michael Johnson was the epitome of success. In the bustling streets of New York City, where dreams often felt like mere whispers against the noise of ambition, he stood tall. A self-made millionaire, CEO of one of the most promising tech startups in the country, Michael had built his empire from scratch. Yet for all his boardroom victories and financial triumphs, nothing mattered more to him than his daughter, Ava Johnson. Ava was 9 years old, a radiant little girl whose smile could brighten even the grayest New York morning. She had inherited her father's sharp mind and her late mother's warmth. Enrolled in one of the most prestigious private schools in Manhattan, Michael had always believed Ava was safe, surrounded by the best educators and peers that money could buy. He often reassured himself that his success was, above all, to guarantee Ava a life free from the hardships he had once faced. Their home, perched atop a luxurious skyscraper, was filled with laughter, music, and memories of better times. Ava, with her love for drawing and an unshakable curiosity, often transformed their apartment into a gallery of colorful sketches and imaginative stories. To Michael, she was more than just his daughter. She was his world. Michael's routine rarely allowed him the chance to pick Ava up from school. Board meetings, investor calls, and late-night brainstorming sessions usually kept him occupied. But on that particular Friday, he decided to surprise her. He wrapped up a morning meeting earlier than expected, ignored a flurry of unread emails, and headed to Ava's school, eager to see her face light up at the sight of him. As he parked his sleek black SUV outside the stately brick building, he noticed parents chatting cheerfully by the gates. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. He waited patiently, glancing occasionally at the grand entrance, expecting Ava to burst out with the same excitement he always saw at home. But when the classroom doors finally opened and the students poured out, Ava wasn't among the smiling children. Moments later, she appeared, head lowered, dragging her feet as if each step weighed her down. Michael's heart sank. Gone was the usual spark in her eyes, replaced instead by puffy, tear-stained cheeks. Behind her, a small group of children snickered and whispered, casting sideways glances that made Michael's stomach twist. He immediately stepped out of the car, waving to catch her attention, but Ava barely lifted her head. As she climbed into the car, the silence was deafening. Michael, unsettled, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She stared blankly out, the window lost in thought, as though building an invisible wall between herself and the world. The drive home felt longer than usual, each red light giving Michael more time to wonder what could have possibly stolen his daughter's radiant joy. He wanted to ask, but something about Ava's demeanor held him back. For the first time in years, Michael felt a gnawing sense of helplessness. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and he feared it was only the beginning. The silence in the car grew heavier with each passing block as they drove through the towering skyscrapers and crowded streets of Manhattan. Michael's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, fighting the urge to bombard Ava with questions. He could see her reflection in the rearview mirror, staring vacantly at the blur of the city rushing past her window. The usual spark, the bright curiosity that made Ava who she was, had vanished, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. Michael, a man who had closed billion-dollar deals and faced ruthless competitors, now felt powerless, sitting just feet away from his own daughter, unable to reach her. Once they arrived at the penthouse, Ava hurried inside without a word, dropping her backpack by the door and disappearing into her room. Michael stood frozen, watching the trail of her small footsteps on the polished wooden floor. He felt like an intruder in his own home, as if a barrier had been erected between him and Ava overnight. Trying to process the sudden change, he wandered into the kitchen, staring at the coffee machine without really seeing it. He had always believed that Ava's school was her safe haven. The mere thought of her being unhappy, much less distressed, in a place meant to nurture her was unbearable. Hours passed. Michael tried to distract himself with emails and calls, but his mind kept circling back to Ava's tearful face and the mocking laughter of the children behind her. Eventually, he walked past her room, and noticed the door slightly ajar. Peeking inside, he saw Ava curled up on her bed, sketching aimlessly in her notebook, her eyes swollen and red. His heart ached. Deciding to give her space, he returned to the living room, hoping she would open up when she was ready. As evening descended and the city lights began twinkling across the skyline, Michael went to check on Ava again. This time, she was fast, asleep, clutching her notebook like a shield. Gently, he tucked her in and kissed her forehead. It was then that he noticed her backpack still lying untouched by the door. Something compelled him to open it, not out of distrust, but sheer desperation, to understand what was happening. As he unzipped the worn fabric, a small stack of crumpled papers fell out. With trembling hands, Michael unfolded them, expecting to find typical school assignments or scribbled drawings. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Each paper was laced with cruel words and hateful sketches. "Go back to where you came. From you don't belong here, and why is your skin so dirty?" were just a few of the vile messages scrawled in shaky handwriting. Some were anonymous, while others bore the signatures of Ava's classmates, names Michael recognized from PTA meetings and school events, children of parents he had exchanged pleasantries with countless times. A wave of nausea washed over him. He had faced cutthroat investors and corporate betrayals, but nothing compared to the gut-wrenching agony of realizing that his little girl had been carrying this burden alone. His mind raced through memories, looking for signs he might have missed. Ava's sudden reluctance to talk about school, her subtle changes in mood, the forced smiles. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. Unable to contain his emotions, Michael sank into the nearest chair, the hateful notes scattered on the floor around him. Tears welled in his eyes, but he wiped them away furiously. He couldn't afford to be weak, not now. Ava needed him to be strong. Yet amidst the flood of emotions, one thought consumed him. How long had this been going on? How could no one have told him? Worse, how could the school have allowed it? The next morning, determined but careful, Michael approached Ava with a soft voice. "Sweetheart, can we talk?" he asked, kneeling beside her bed. Ava, still groggy, clutched her notebook tightly. Michael gently laid one of the crumpled papers on her lap. Ava's eyes widened in horror, her small hands trembling as she tried to push it away. "No, Daddy, please. Don't be mad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael shook his head, fighting back tears. "Mad?" "Ava, I could never be mad at you. I just want to know why you didn't tell me." Ava's lips quivered. She hesitated, glancing down at the floor as if searching for words hidden between the cracks. Finally, the floodgates opened. Ava burst into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Between hiccups and gasps for air, she confessed everything. The daily taunts, the cruel jokes, the isolating whispers behind her back. "I was scared," she admitted. "I thought if I told you it would only get worse, and I didn't want you to think I wasn't strong." Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if trying to shield her from every cruel word she had endured. "Ava, you are the strongest person I know, and you're not alone anymore," he whispered. In that moment, Michael's love for his daughter transformed into something fiercer, more resolute. He swore silently that he would not let this continue, not for Ava, nor for any other child suffering in silence. But deep down, he also knew this was bigger than a few mean kids. The problem ran deeper, tangled in the very fabric of the school's culture, protected by silence and power. He could sense it. And if there was one thing Michael Johnson had learned from his rise in the business world, it was that sometimes, to change a system, you needed to shake it from its very foundation. Still holding Ava close, he vowed to himself that this was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning. The following days passed like an unbearable fog over Michael's household. Ava, though slightly relieved by having finally spoken the truth to her father, remained visibly withdrawn. Her once vibrant and imaginative energy had dimmed, and even her drawings, previously filled with fantastical landscapes and cheerful figures, had turned into somber images of grey skies and faceless crowds. Michael, however, had no intention of letting his daughter sink further into this state without a fight. He balanced his professional commitments as best he could while dedicating every free moment to observing and understanding the extent of the damage. One evening after Ava had gone to bed, Michael sat in his office surrounded by the cruel notes he had found in her backpack. He spread them across his desk like pieces of a sinister puzzle. He noticed patterns. Certain names appeared more frequently, and specific phrases seemed to be echoed in multiple notes, suggesting that this bullying wasn't isolated, but systematic. His analytical mind, sharpened by years in the corporate world, instinctively searched for connections. He cross-referenced the names with parents he had met at school galas, fundraising events, and charity dinners. What he discovered only deepened his horror. Many of these children were sons and daughters of the school's most influential benefactors, the very people who, like him, had significant financial ties to the institution. The next day, determined to learn more without alarming Ava or causing unnecessary panic, Michael drove her to school himself. As they approached the towering, ivy-clad building, he paid closer attention to the behavior of the other children. From a distance, he observed small groups clustered together, whispering and occasionally casting disdainful glances toward Ava as she hesitantly walked through the gates. Teachers, absorbed in their routines or conversations, appeared oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent to what was unfolding under their noses. Refusing to turn a blind eye, Michael returned home and began contacting parents under the guise of organizing a social event. Through casual conversations, he confirmed his suspicions. The bullying wasn't just tolerated, it was subtly reinforced by a toxic culture of silence. Some parents dismissed the issue as kids being kids, while others changed the subject altogether. A few even hinted that Ava might be too sensitive or not fitting in properly, comments that made Michael's blood boil. He realized that the problem wasn't limited to a few cruel children. It stemmed from an entrenched system where privilege shielded prejudice and discomfort was swept under the rug to preserve appearances. One evening, while organizing Ava's school supplies, Michael noticed a notebook he hadn't seen before. It was hidden beneath a pile of drawings and appeared to be a personal journal. Hesitating for a moment, unsure if he should invade her privacy, he finally opened it, hoping to understand her suffering more deeply. What he read shattered him. Page after page documented her experiences, accounts of mockery, the sting of being excluded from games, whispers in hallways, teachers turning a blind eye, and even moments where Ava questioned if something was wrong with her simply because of the color of her skin. One entry described the unbearable loneliness she felt during lunch breaks, sitting alone while others avoided her as if she were invisible. The emotional weight of her words struck Michael like a tidal wave. He could barely recognize the confident, spirited little girl he knew in these sorrowful pages. He sat in silence, struggling to process how much Ava had endured alone. For the first time since he had become a father, he felt as though he had failed to protect her, not out of neglect, but because he had trusted an institution that didn't deserve it. His eyes welled up, but he quickly wiped the tears away. There was no time for despair. He needed to act. Determined to confront the situation from every angle, Michael began discreetly gathering more information. He reached out to a few sympathetic parents he trusted, those who had children from diverse backgrounds and whom he knew shared his values. They too had noticed unsettling patterns, but had remained silent out of fear of retaliation or futility. Encouraged by their cautious support, Michael organized informal meetings at his apartment under the pretense of friendly get-togethers. There, behind closed doors, they shared stories of exclusion, racially insensitive remarks from faculty, and a general sense that complaints would lead nowhere. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The school had been systematically ignoring the struggles of its minority students to maintain its pristine reputation. Michael's anger, however, wasn't reckless. It was focused. He knew that charging into the principal's office with accusations would only make the situation worse. He needed undeniable proof, and more importantly, a strategy that would expose the rot at the core of the school without jeopardizing Ava or the other children suffering in silence. Late into the night, as Manhattan's cityscape glittered outside, His office window, Michael began to sketch out a plan. It wouldn't be enough to confront the school privately. Too many voices had been silenced already. What was needed was undeniable, public accountability. He began consulting discreetly with a legal team and a trusted PR firm, explaining the situation without revealing Ava's name. The professionals were horrified, but also realistic. They advised caution, knowing the school's legal and financial resources were vast. Michael, however, was prepared to use every ounce of influence he possessed, not for revenge, but for justice. Meanwhile, Ava remained unaware of her father's growing crusade. At home, Michael made sure to keep their routines as normal and comforting as possible, encouraging her art and spending more time together, taking her to museums, parks, and their favorite diners. Ava, though still burdened, began to show slight glimpses of her old self during these moments, laughing softly when Michael jokingly failed at art projects or burned pancakes on Sunday mornings. These fragile but precious smiles only reinforced Michael's resolve. In the back of his mind, however, the question lingered. How deep did the corruption go? Was it only among the teachers and the director, or were the board members and larger stakeholders complicit? As he connected more dots, Michael knew that uncovering the full extent of the problem would take time, but every second was worth it if it meant giving Ava and countless other children the dignity and safety they deserved. Yet as he prepared for what was to come, Michael knew one thing for certain. The battle ahead would be nothing compared to what his daughter had already endured in silence. And for that alone, he could not and would not back down. The following week unfolded under a somber sky, both outside Michael's penthouse and within its walls. Every morning, Michael drove Ava to school, watching as she hesitated at the gates, clinging for a few extra seconds to the safety of his presence before walking reluctantly inside. And every afternoon, he waited for her with the hope that somehow things might have improved, only to see the same defeated expression cloud her face. Though she tried to smile, to assure him with meek words that everything was fine, Michael knew she was lying. The spark had yet to return to her eyes, and that absence haunted him. Late one evening, after they shared a quiet dinner with barely a handful of words exchanged, Michael decided he could no longer endure the silence. He waited until Ava finished her shower and was about to retreat into her room when he gently called her to the living room. The city lights flickered behind them, casting their soft glow against the expansive windows, but Ava stood still, staring at the floor, clutching her sketchbook tightly against her chest. Michael's voice trembled slightly as he invited her to sit next to him. After a long pause, Ava complied, sitting at the edge of the couch, distant and apprehensive. Michael reached for the pile of notes he had discovered. Without saying a word, he laid them out in front of her. Ava's small frame tensed instantly, and her eyes darted from the notes to her father. He could see the panic rising within her, as if the weight of every insult had returned all at once. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, her lower lip quivered, and tears welled up until they rolled silently down her cheeks. Michael extended his hand to hold hers, but Ava pulled away instinctively, retreating into herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "I didn't want to make you sad. I didn't want you to hate me." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He leaned forward, gently lifting her chin so she would look him in the eyes. "Ava, how could you ever think I would hate you?" His voice cracked, but he fought to stay calm for her. "You are my entire world. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could ever make me love you less." The floodgates opened. Ava sobbed uncontrollably, collapsing into her father's arms. Between heavy breaths and choked words, she recounted the nightmare she had endured. From the first day when a group of kids mocked her braids, calling them weird ropes, to the cruel jokes comparing her skin color to dirt, and the persistent exclusion that made every school day a torment. She confessed that it wasn't just words. Their stares, the subtle shoves in the hallways, the way teachers overlooked her in group activities, all combined to make her feel invisible, as if she were unwanted in a place where everyone else belonged. Through sobs, Ava revealed that she had tried to tell a teacher once, but the response had been dismissive. The teacher had smiled politely and told her not to take it so personally, assuring her that children were just playing. After that, Ava stopped seeking help. She internalized the pain, convinced that complaining would only isolate her further. Michael listened, motionless, feeling his own heart fracture piece by piece with every word his daughter uttered. He held her tightly, whispering softly that none of this was her fault and that no one had the right to make her feel less than she was. When Ava finally fell asleep in his arms, exhausted from the emotional storm, Michael carefully carried her to bed. He stood by her side for a long time, watching her peaceful, tear-streaked face as she clutched the same sketchbook she always carried. Only now did Michael fully realize that Ava had been drawing not merely for fun, but as a means of escaping and processing her pain. Each drawing was a silent cry for help that he had failed to hear. Returning to the living room, Michael sat in the dark, staring at the night cityscape beyond the windows. The noise of Manhattan suddenly seemed distant, insignificant. He was filled with an unbearable mixture of rage, sorrow, and determination. He replayed every word Ava had said, every moment she had described, imagining her sitting alone during recess, eating lunch in silence, watching other kids laugh and play without her. How could a place that promised to educate and nurture children allow such cruelty to fester within its walls? He knew now that confronting individual parents or teachers would not be enough. This wasn't about isolated acts of cruelty. It was about a systemic failure. A culture that allowed discrimination to be softened with words like kids being kids and ignored when it came at the expense of children like Ava. Michael's blood boiled at the thought that there were likely other children suffering just as his daughter had, trapped within the same oppressive silence. That night he opened his laptop and began drafting a plan, not just as a father seeking justice for his daughter, but as a strategist determined to expose a corrupted system. His mind, trained to identify weaknesses and opportunities, now saw the school not as an impenetrable institution, but as a fragile facade held together by reputation and influence. If he could find the right leverage, he could bring the truth to light. And Michael Johnson had influence. He knew how to use it, quietly, powerfully, and, when necessary, devastatingly. Before shutting down for the night, he took one last look at Ava's journal. Tucked between the pages, he found a drawing that made him pause. It was a self-portrait of Ava standing alone on one side of a playground, while a crowd of faceless children played together on the other side. The only color on Ava's side was gray, while the rest of the scene was vibrant and full of life. Michael knew this wasn't just a drawing, it was a message, a window into how isolated and alien Ava felt every single day. Clutching the journal, "Close," Michael whispered to the empty room. "I promise, Ava, I will fix this, no matter what it takes." And in the silence of that promise, a plan was born that would soon shake the very foundation of the prestigious school that had failed, his daughter. Michael spent the next several days navigating through the corridors of silence that seemed to entangle every corner of the prestigious school Ava attended. Each morning, he walked his daughter to the gates, and each afternoon, he stood watching. From a distance as she emerged quietly, head down, clutching her sketchbook like a lifeline, Michael began to notice the same pattern repeating itself, the same children whispering behind Ava's back, the same vacant expressions on the faces of teachers who, with deliberate disinterest, pretended not to see. At first, Michael considered addressing the issue directly with the school's administration. However, every time he visualized that confrontation, he remembered Ava's trembling voice recounting how even teachers had turned away from her pleas. He knew that approaching the administration unprepared would likely result in empty reassurances and subtle retaliation against Ava. The problem, he suspected, was much larger than isolated incidents of ignorance. It was embedded in the school's culture, protected by the power and influence of the very families who donated millions every year to maintain its elite status. Determined to understand the depth of this system, Michael began investigating quietly. He arranged casual meetings with parents he trusted, particularly those from minority backgrounds who might have faced similar situations. In expensive cafes, discreet office meetings, and even chance encounters at charity galas, he gathered stories that mirrored Ava's. Parents shared accounts of children being subtly excluded from activities, teachers dismissing concerns, and a pervasive fear of speaking up. Several confessed they had once considered transferring their children, but worried about the stigma or the disruption it would cause. Michael meticulously documented every story, every pattern. The names of children involved in Ava's bullying began to form a troubling list. Last names synonymous with old money, corporate dynasties, and influential donors who held seats on the school's board. Even more unsettling was the realization that many teachers who had turned a blind eye were themselves bound by contracts heavily influenced by these same families. Michael could see it clearly. This wasn't just about schoolyard bullying. It was about power, preservation, and complicity. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Michael infiltrated school events, blending seamlessly among other parents. He noticed how certain families commanded unspoken authority. Their children roamed the school grounds with unchecked confidence, their actions never questioned. Teachers flinched subtly when addressed by these parents, and administrators bent over backward to appease them. Michael's presence, often seen as that of a successful but uninvolved father, worked to his advantage. He moved unnoticed, gathering pieces of the puzzle with each passing day. It was during one of these events, a fundraising dinner held in the school's grand auditorium, that Michael uncovered a detail that left him both furious and resolute. As speeches echoed through the lavishly decorated hall, he overheard two parents discussing how the school discreetly handled uncomfortable situations. They mentioned with unsettling nonchalance how incidents involving minority students were often minimized or reframed to avoid drawing negative attention. One even joked that it was better for everyone if certain children learned their place early on. Michael gripped his glass so tightly it nearly shattered in his hand. Later that evening, while reviewing recordings and notes in his office, Michael's suspicions were confirmed. There was an orchestrated effort within the institution to downplay incidents like Ava's, prioritizing the school's image over the well-being of its students. Even more chilling was the revelation that this strategy wasn't new. It had been in place for years, quietly ensuring that influential families remained satisfied while students like Ava suffered in silence. Despite the temptation to storm into the principal's office and expose everything, Michael knew that a public confrontation without irrefutable proof would only result in Ava facing further isolation or retaliation. He needed more than stories and whispered confessions. He needed undeniable evidence. Determined to protect his daughter and countless others, Michael intensified his investigation. He hired a discreet private investigator to look deeper into the school's history. The investigator unearthed past complaints from parents, legal settlements quietly handled out of court, and faculty turnover that coincided suspiciously with the surfacing of racial discrimination allegations. It became evident that the school operated on a fragile but well-maintained network of silence and fear. Meanwhile, Michael made sure Ava remained unaware of his actions. At home, he nurtured her creativity, encouraged her to talk about her feelings when she felt comfortable, and reminded her daily of her worth. Though she continued to struggle, small moments of joy began to reappear. An occasional laugh, a new drawing with a touch of color, moments where the weight seemed just a little lighter. These glimpses fueled Michael's resolve even more. Each night, as the city outside buzzed with its usual chaos, Michael pieced together the growing evidence against the school. He discovered that the principal, faculty members, and board members had systematically covered up not only bullying, but also instances of overt racial discrimination, all in the name of protecting the school's reputation. Former staff, when approached carefully, corroborated the existence of unofficial directives instructing teachers to handle situations quietly to avoid attracting external scrutiny. What struck Michael the most was how deeply normalized this behavior had become. It wasn't just institutional, it was cultural. The silence, the complicity, the subtle justifications, it all functioned as an invisible barrier that isolated students like Ava while shielding those responsible. As he stared at the mountain of evidence compiled on his desk, Michael realized that this wasn't just about saving Ava from the cruelty she had endured. It was about dismantling a culture, that had gone unchecked for far too long. Ava's suffering was the symptom of a much larger disease, and Michael knew that no amount of influence or financial power wielded by the school's inner circle would protect them once the truth came to light. He had everything he needed to act, but what haunted him now was how to do it in a way that would not only expose the rot, but also create lasting change. He was a strategist by nature, and he knew that the next move would determine not just the future of the school, but the healing Ava and other children so desperately needed. And as he turned off the lights and gazed out at the sleepless city beyond his window, Michael vowed that he would not rest until the truth was undeniable and the silence was forever broken. The morning of the much-anticipated school presentation arrived under a heavy grey sky, the kind that seemed to mirror Michael's apprehension. It was an event Ava had looked forward to for weeks, a grand annual showcase where each student contributed to a collective performance designed to highlight the school's commitment to excellence, creativity, and community. Ava had been practicing her role tirelessly, rehearsing lines and perfecting dance steps in the living room, while Michael watched with pride, capturing each moment on his phone. Yet, when the day arrived, the atmosphere inside the Johnson household was anything but festive. Michael, already suspicious of the administration's behavior, decided to accompany Ava personally, hoping his presence might deter any further mistreatment. Ava, however, seemed unusually quiet, staring at her reflection in the car window, twirling the end of one of her braids nervously. Upon arriving, Michael noticed that other students were huddled in excitement, parents greeted teachers warmly, and everything appeared orchestrated to perfection. Yet something felt off. Michael could sense it in the way Ava lingered near him longer than usual, reluctant to join her classmates. When the parents and guests were guided to the auditorium, Michael found his seat near the front, scanning the program booklet Ava had proudly given him earlier in the week. Her name, listed under the Winter Mosaic performance, was printed clearly alongside her classmates. As the performance began, Michael leaned forward, eager to watch his daughter shine. He knew how much this meant to her. Ava had always used her creativity as an outlet, and this presentation was supposed to be her moment to stand proudly among her peers. One by one, the children took the stage, performing skits, dances, and songs. Parents cheered, teachers applauded, and the entire room buzzed with pride. But as the group that was supposed to include Ava assembled on stage, Michael's stomach dropped. His daughter was nowhere to be seen. He scanned the crowded room, convinced there had been a mistake. Perhaps she was backstage, maybe preparing for a solo segment. Yet as the performance continued, it became painfully clear that Ava had been excluded. Michael's eyes locked onto Ava, standing unnoticed at the very edge of the auditorium, partially hidden behind the curtains, clutching her sketchbook. She watched her classmates perform the routine she had practiced countless times at home, her expression a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. The scene was so cruelly orchestrated that it left no room for doubt. This was no oversight. Michael's fists clenched as he realized the depth of the discrimination. His daughter wasn't just being bullied by students. She was being systematically erased by the very institution meant to protect and uplift her. As the performance ended, the crowd erupted in applause. Parents congratulated their children, teachers exchanged satisfied smiles, and the principal, standing proudly on stage, thanked everyone for their support. All the while, Ava remained frozen in place, her small figure blending into the shadows. Michael rushed to her side, kneeling to meet her eyes, but Ava wouldn't look at him. Tears streamed down her face silently as she whispered, "They said I wasn't needed anymore, that it would look better without me." Michael could barely contain the storm brewing inside him. His initial instinct was to stand up, interrupt the entire event, and expose the injustice in front of every parent and faculty member. But as he held Ava, feeling her small body tremble against him, he knew that an outburst would only humiliate her further and risk her safety. This was no longer just about confronting bullies or negligent teachers. It was a declaration from the institution itself. They had deliberately isolated Ava, silenced her, and made sure she knew exactly where she stood. When they returned home, Ava said little. She locked herself in her room, leaving Michael alone with the unbearable silence. He sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food he had prepared earlier, his mind racing. The school had crossed a line that could never be undone. They had publicly humiliated his daughter, reduced her to an invisible bystander in an event she had dedicated herself to, and treated her as if she were a blemish on their perfectly curated image. Michael spent the entire night pacing the apartment, the city lights beyond the glass walls flickering like distant stars. He replayed every interaction, every dismissive meeting with teachers, every smug smile from board members, every parent who shrugged off concerns. He had all the evidence, the testimonies, the recordings, and now undeniable proof that the discrimination wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was performed openly, shamelessly, in front of the very community that was supposed to oppose. But what burned most was the look in Ava's eyes, the resignation of a child who had just accepted that she wasn't wanted. That image alone was enough to fuel Michael's resolve beyond anything he had ever experienced in his professional life. He was no stranger to adversity, having clawed his way from humble beginnings to the top of the corporate world. But this was personal. And for the first time, he wasn't fighting for market shares or investor trust. He was fighting for his daughter's dignity and for the hundreds of other children whose silent suffering had been ignored. By sunrise, Michael had already outlined the next phase of his plan. He wouldn't just expose the school, he would dismantle its web of silence piece by piece until every person responsible was held accountable. He contacted his legal team, instructed his investigator to dig even deeper, and prepared to mobilize every resource at his disposal. If the school thought it could bury Ava under its reputation and wealth, it was about to learn what it truly meant to face a father with nothing left to lose. And while Ava remained behind her closed bedroom door, silently processing the cruel reality she had been forced to endure, Michael stood by the window, watching as the first rays of light pierced through the city's towering skyline. His reflection on the glass showed a father ready for battle, and in that still moment he made a silent vow. This would be the last time Ava would ever feel invisible, not just at school, but anywhere. And no matter the cost, he would make sure of it. Michael entered the following weeks with a determination so fierce it felt like armor against the cold indifference he had witnessed. Gone was the hesitation, replaced by the precision of a strategist who knew that the battlefield was not only the school's administrative offices, but the hearts and minds of every stakeholder who had chosen silence over justice. He moved like a ghost among the parents, the faculty, and even the board, never revealing his true intentions, careful to gather information without arousing suspicion. At the next PTA meeting, Michael arrived early, blending seamlessly into the crowd of impeccably dressed parents. He listened attentively as the principal delivered her usual speech about academic excellence and the school's commitment to diversity, words that now sounded like bitter mockery. Michael's face remained neutral, but beneath the surface, every sentence fueled the storm inside him. He noted how certain parents nodded along, oblivious or willfully ignorant, while others, particularly those he knew had children of color, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Over the following days, Michael intensified his quiet surveillance. He attended sports games, art exhibitions, and even casual parent mixes organized by the school. Dressed in his usual tailored suits, always approachable, always courteous, Michael became just another successful father supporting his child. What no one knew was that every conversation he had, every casual remark, every subtle gesture he observed was being carefully recorded and analyzed. He was building a comprehensive picture of the school's social dynamics, noting who held influence, who protected whom, and who showed cracks of dissent behind the facade. Michael didn't stop at the social level. He also requested, through his legal channels, financial reports, meeting minutes from board sessions, and policy documents available to donors and benefactors. As a major contributor, he was entitled to such information, and the school provided it without suspecting his true intentions. Within those documents, Michael found exactly what he feared: patterns of selective disciplinary actions, budget allocations that prioritized aesthetic improvements over student welfare programs, and alarming inconsistencies in records concerning racial discrimination complaints. Cases were routinely marked as resolved, with no documentation of any investigation or resolution process. Even more damning was the discovery that certain faculty members who had previously raised concerns had quietly resigned or been pressured out, their departures masked by generic announcements praising their new opportunities elsewhere. Michael cross-referenced these cases with timelines provided by his private investigator, and discovered that these faculty members had all either reported incidents similar to Ava's or advocated for more inclusive policies within the school. This was no coincidence. It was a systematic silencing. What angered Michael the most was how deeply the corruption was rooted. The principal, who often smiled warmly during public events, was directly implicated. Emails and internal memos obtained legally, but discreetly hinted at her role in downplaying serious complaints to avoid drawing negative attention from the board or risking donor dissatisfaction. The teachers, some complicit and others simply too fearful to speak out, had become pawns in a system that prioritized reputation over responsibility. Despite the overwhelming frustration, Michael knew better than to act impulsively. His experience taught him that timing and execution were everything. He began collaborating secretly with a small group of parents who, like him, were disillusioned but unsure of how to fight back. These were parents who had whispered concerns at events, who had stayed behind after meetings to express unease, but lacked the power or knowledge to challenge the system. Under Michael's guidance, they formed a quiet coalition, gathering testimonies, evidence, and preparing for the day they would no longer have to whisper. In parallel, Michael ensured Ava remained unaware of the depths of his actions. At home, he became more present than ever, spending evenings with her, helping with homework, and encouraging her to continue expressing herself through art. He noticed her drawings gradually regaining color, subtle hints that she was beginning to feel safer within the confines of their home, if nowhere else. Yet he knew that without action, the temporary comfort they built together would crumble the moment Ava stepped beyond their door. Then came the critical breakthrough. One evening, a young teacher, visibly anxious, approached Michael discreetly after a school fundraiser. She confessed that she could no longer stand by and watch what was happening. With trembling hands, she handed him copies of internal emails, disciplinary records altered under administrative pressure, and personal notes detailing multiple incidents involving Ava and other minority students. What was most shocking was a document outlining an unwritten but widely acknowledged practice within the school: to prioritize the school's image above all else, even if that meant minimizing, altering, or burying complaints of discrimination. Armed with this undeniable evidence, Michael felt the weight of months of anguish lift slightly from his shoulders. He finally had the key to unlock the silence. However, he also understood that a public revelation of this magnitude required more than documents. It required preparation, allies, and a platform that would make ignoring the truth impossible. Michael returned home that night with a heavy but hopeful heart. He found Ava asleep on the couch, sketchbook by her side, a half-finished drawing of a tree blooming with color, standing alone in a vast gray field. He gently carried her to bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered the same silent promise he had made before, now renewed with certainty. The plan was no longer theoretical. The pieces were all in place. The silent strategist had become the relentless avenger. Michael was ready, not just to challenge the school, but to make sure that every child like Ava would never again be silenced. What the school didn't know was that its greatest adversary had already infiltrated its inner circle and was about to turn the very foundations it stood on into dust. And when it happened, there would be no quiet cover-up, no private settlement, no polite deflection. There would be truth, and it would be undeniable. The highly anticipated annual charity gala of the school arrived under a veil of grandeur. The majestic event was hosted at one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels, decorated with chandeliers dripping with crystal, tables dressed in gold and white, and banners showcasing the school's mission of excellence, diversity, and integrity. Michael observed the irony bitterly. This very institution, which dared to inscribe such words on its walls and promotional material, had built its reputation by suppressing voices like Ava's. Yet tonight, amidst the laughter, clinking glasses and symphony music, Michael knew the school was about to face a truth none of its members could ignore. He arrived punctually, dressed impeccably, blending seamlessly among the affluent guests. Every detail of the night was precisely choreographed by the school's administration to impress donors and secure future contributions. Board members, including the principal, circulated gracefully, offering charming smiles and small talk. Teachers mingled respectfully, careful not to breach the invisible lines set by the hierarchy of influence. Michael noticed how some parents, particularly those who had remained indifferent to Ava's suffering, paraded through the room as if attending a coronation. Yet, beneath their polished exteriors, Michael saw the subtle cracks, the nervous glances, the carefully measured words. There were already whispers about complaints, murmurs about uncomfortable questions raised by some parents, and the quiet tension of those who feared the fragile illusion might soon collapse. Michael took his place among the tables without drawing attention. As the evening unfolded with speeches and award presentations, he remained still, carefully observing every gesture, every interaction. When the principal took the stage to address the room, praising the school's unwavering commitment to every child, Michael saw the facade fully for what it was, an empty performance played for the benefit of those who preferred to see only what made them comfortable. But Michael was not the only one watching. He noticed subtle but significant signals from the few parents who had joined his coalition. A silent nod here, a lingering gaze there. They were ready. The pivotal moment arrived during the principal's announcement of the gala's special highlight, the unveiling of the school's new diversity and inclusion initiative, designed in her words to ensure that every child feels seen, heard, and valued. The irony was unbearable. As the crowd applauded, oblivious to the hypocrisy, Michael stood up from his seat and without invitation walked calmly toward the stage. Conversations hushed as all eyes turned toward him. Some recognized him merely as Ava's father. Others knew him as a successful entrepreneur and generous donor. None, however, expected what was about to unfold. Michael, holding a slim portfolio, took the microphone from the principal with measured composure. The principal hesitated, visibly unsettled but trapped by the eyes of hundreds of guests, journalists, and fellow board members. Michael's voice, steady but filled with quiet authority, broke the silence. "For months," he began, "I have watched, listened, and gathered stories, not just from my daughter but from countless other children and families. Stories of exclusion, silence, and deliberate ignorance. And while this evening celebrates the school's supposed commitment to diversity and inclusion, I stand here to tell you that this is a lie." Gasps filled the room. The principal, frozen at his side, could do nothing as Michael, calmly and methodically, revealed document after document, case after case. He detailed the manipulated records, the silenced complaints, and the systematic erasure of minority students' experiences. His words, though controlled, carried the weight of undeniable truth. Screens behind him, originally set to display promotional images, now projected copies of redacted emails, handwritten notes from teachers pressured into silence, and anonymous testimonies from affected families. Michael's presentation was not a spectacle, it was a reckoning. The audience, filled with parents who had trusted the institution blindly, sat in stunned silence. Some parents whispered urgently among themselves, others stared blankly, processing the magnitude of the revelations. Teachers shifted uncomfortably, some visibly distressed, others ashamed. Even board members, accustomed to managing crises behind closed doors, appeared pale and rattled. Yet the most powerful moment came when Michael, without raising his voice, recounted Ava's story, not with dramatics but with heartbreaking sincerity. He described how she had rehearsed every night for the very performance she was denied, how she sat alone watching her classmates take the stage without her, how she returned home believing she was less because of who she was. His voice faltered, Slightly, but he quickly regained composure. "My daughter is not invisible," he declared, "and neither are the countless others who have endured this same cruelty." By the time he finished, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The gala, intended to be a night of celebration, had become an unmasking. The principal, visibly shaken, attempted to respond, but her words were drowned by the murmur of the audience. Parents who had remained passive until now began questioning openly. Several teachers left the room in tears. Michael did not wait for applause or acknowledgement. He stepped down calmly, returning to his seat as the room erupted into a chaotic blend of questions, accusations, and frantic attempts by the administration to regain control. Michael's allies among the parents approached him discreetly, offering subtle gestures of solidarity. He knew this was only the beginning of what would follow: media coverage, investigations, and most importantly, change. But as he sat quietly amid the storm he had unleashed, he felt no triumph, only resolve. For Ava, for every child who had endured the school's silent cruelty, this night marked the start of a battle they would no longer fight alone. And as the principal struggled to contain the unraveling gala, Michael knew without a shadow of a doubt that the silence had been shattered. What remained now was the responsibility to turn the exposed truth into lasting justice. The school's shield of reputation had been pierced, and there would be no going back. Ava and every child like her would be heard. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. The days following the gala were marked by an uproar that reverberated far beyond the school's elegant stone walls. The media, initially oblivious to the systemic issues Michael had unveiled, now flooded the story across headlines, social media, platforms, and news broadcasts. What was supposed to have been a triumphant celebration of the school's achievements became a public relations nightmare. Journalists dissected the documents Michael had revealed, and testimonies from other families began surfacing rapidly, many emboldened by Michael's courage to speak out. What struck the public the most was the methodical nature of the discrimination. The leaked internal communications, showcasing how teachers had been instructed to handle complaints quietly, sparked outrage. Parents and citizens who had once viewed the institution as an untouchable pillar of academic excellence now saw it as an emblem of hypocrisy. Civil rights organizations, child advocacy groups, and influential public figures openly condemned the school's actions. Protests began forming outside its gates, with placards demanding justice, inclusion, and accountability. Inside the school, the atmosphere was one of chaos. Teachers, many of whom had participated passively in the culture of silence, now faced their own guilt and fear. Some resigned immediately, unwilling to be associated with what had been uncovered. Others, finally freed from the weight of institutional intimidation, joined the growing chorus demanding change. Students whispered about Ava and her father, some expressing shame, others for the first time. Understanding the gravity of what had happened, the board of directors held emergency meetings behind closed doors, but the damage was irreparable. They had lost control of the narrative. Michael, meanwhile, remained composed but focused. He declined interviews, avoided sensationalism, and instead channeled his energy into careful strategy. He knew that exposing the truth was only the first step. Lasting change required more than just public outrage. He began crafting a comprehensive reform proposal, one that would ensure the structural overhaul of the school's policies: mandatory training on diversity and inclusion, independent oversight, and above all, protections for every student who had ever felt silenced. Yet Michael also knew that no matter how righteous the cause, change would not come easily. The families of many of the children implicated in the bullying were among the school's most powerful donors. Some retaliated subtly, threatening to withdraw funding or file lawsuits. Yet Michael was prepared. Every threat was met with calm defiance. His legal team, now supported by civil rights attorneys, ensured that nothing could intimidate or silence him. Michael's strategy was clear. The school would either accept profound change, or it would crumble under the weight of its own corruption. During this turbulent period, Michael also prioritized Ava's well-being. He shielded her as best as he could from the media storm, carefully explaining only what she needed to know. He reassured her daily, reminding her that she was brave, that she had done nothing wrong, and that the world was now listening because of her courage. Slowly, Ava began to trust again, not fully, not yet, but enough to let glimmers of hope reappear in her drawings. Instead of gray shadows, she now painted rays of light breaking through dark clouds. Instead of empty spaces, figures began filling, her pages once more standing beside her rather than apart. Michael's resolve deepened as he noticed these small signs. He met quietly with the coalition of parents, teachers, and community leaders who had rallied behind him. They crafted a formal proposal, not as a mere demand, but as a blueprint for systemic change. Included were provisions for a dedicated diversity office, mental health support for affected students, the creation of a student-led inclusion council, and mandatory transparency in handling discrimination complaints. When the board finally convened for the decisive meeting, Michael entered the room not as a desperate father, but as a leader carrying the voice of an entire community. The principal, now visibly worn and cornered by the magnitude of the scandal, attempted to maintain a semblance of control, but the balance of power had shifted. Parents who had once applauded her politely now questioned her integrity. Teachers, emboldened by Michael's unwavering stance, voiced their own stories, revealing a pattern of fear and compliance that could no longer be ignored. Michael presented the reform proposal with precision, leaving no room for ambiguity. "This is not a request," he stated calmly but firmly. "It is the only path forward if this institution wishes to continue existing with dignity." The board members, aware of the legal, financial, and reputational catastrophe looming over them, realized that resistance was no longer an option. Some agreed reluctantly, others more willingly, but the consensus was clear. Change was inevitable. Over the following weeks, the implementation began. The principal was placed on indefinite leave pending investigation, several faculty members were dismissed, and new policies were drafted under the supervision of external experts. Independent monitors were assigned to ensure that every measure proposed was enacted faithfully. The culture of silence that had haunted the school for decades began to fracture under the weight of accountability. Michael never sought personal recognition for his actions. When reporters approached him, he redirected their attention to the broader issue, the children who had suffered and those who would never have to again. His commitment remained solely to Ava and to every child like her. The school's physical appearance remained the same, the grand halls, the manicured lawns, but within its walls, the old ways were being dismantled, replaced by an ethos rooted not in empty slogans but in genuine responsibility. For Ava, the changes manifested slowly but meaningfully. Teachers now actively engaged with her. Classmates who had once remained distant approached her with cautious but sincere apologies, and activities were redesigned to foster inclusivity. The transformation was not instant, nor without setbacks, but it was real. And most importantly, Ava no longer walked the hallways feeling invisible. As Michael watched Ava rejoin her world, one where her voice was no longer silenced, he understood that the battle he had waged was far greater than a father's defense of his child. It was the first step in reclaiming a space where every child could stand proud, unafraid, and unapologetically seen. Spring arrived in New York, with the softness of blooming cherry blossoms lining the avenues, and the warmth of longer days. For the first time in months, Michael felt a sense of cautious hope as Ava prepared for her graduation ceremony. The event marked not only the completion of her academic year, but also the closing of one of the most painful chapters in both their lives. Yet behind every smile Ava offered and every laugh she shyly shared, Michael could see traces of the silent battle she had fought. He knew that this day would mean far more than a simple rite of passage. It was the moment when Ava and every student who had suffered silently would finally be acknowledged. The graduation ceremony was set to take place in the school's grand auditorium, the same place where Ava had once stood hidden behind a curtain, watching her classmates perform without her. As Michael escorted her through the familiar hallways, he noticed subtle changes already taking root. Colorful student artwork now decorated the walls, featuring themes of diversity, unity, and resilience. The cold, indifferent stares of the Past had softened into cautious smiles and genuine greetings from teachers and students alike. Parents filled the auditorium, their conversations buzzing with anticipation, yet Michael could sense the underlying tension. The recent events were still fresh in everyone's minds. Some parents avoided eye contact, others offered hesitant nods, and a few approached Michael discreetly to thank him for his courage. But Michael remained focused on Ava, who, dressed in her graduation robe, sat nervously among her classmates. She fidgeted with her bracelet, glancing often toward her father for reassurance. Michael responded with a steady gaze, silently telling her that she was no longer alone. The principal, now temporarily replaced by an interim director, opened the ceremony with a noticeably different tone than previous years. Gone were the hollow platitudes, replaced by a sincere acknowledgement of the school's recent failings and a commitment to a renewed vision of inclusion and justice. The speech, though carefully worded, marked a public admission that could no longer be avoided. Applause followed, subdued but significant. As the ceremony progressed, each student was called to the stage to receive their diploma. Ava sat quietly, tracing the edges of her program booklet. But when her name was finally announced, something unexpected happened. The auditorium, initially offering the usual polite applause, erupted into a standing ovation. Parents, teachers, students, many of whom had remained silent or complicit, now rose to their feet, clapping not just out of formality but with heartfelt admiration. Ava froze, wide-eyed, unsure of how to react. Michael, standing with the crowd, nodded encouragingly. Ava, trembling slightly, walked to the stage. The interim director greeted her with a warm smile and, instead of handing her just a diploma, presented her with a small, unexpected token, a certificate of recognition for courage and resilience. The gesture, though symbolic, carried the weight of months of silence now shattered. Ava hesitated, then accepted it, glancing toward the audience as tears welled in her eyes. This time they were not tears of shame, but of relief, pride, and perhaps the beginning of healing. Michael watched as Ava stood before the audience, holding her certificate tightly. The ovation continued, and amidst it, he could see faces reflecting a variety of emotions: remorse, admiration, and gratitude. The board members, seated solemnly, could not mask their discomfort, knowing that this applause was also an indictment of their failure. Yet, Michael did not focus on them. His attention was solely on Ava, who, for the first time in months, stood on that stage not as an outsider, but as someone recognized, respected, and seen. When the applause finally subsided, Ava returned to her seat, cheeks flushed, but eyes shimmering. Michael noticed her glancing around in disbelief, as if she still struggled to accept that the room, once so cold, now stood behind her. As the ceremony concluded, families gathered outside for pictures and farewells. Ava, usually shy and reserved, was approached by several classmates who, with hesitant but sincere words, offered apologies. Some admitted they hadn't realized the extent of what she had endured. Others confessed they had been too afraid to speak out. Ava, still overwhelmed, accepted their words quietly, but Michael could see the subtle shift in her posture. Shoulders no longer hunched, head held just a little higher. Later that evening, back at their apartment, Michael and Ava sat by the large window overlooking the city. The sunset cast a warm glow over the skyline, and for the first time, the silence between them was peaceful rather than heavy. Ava held her certificate close, occasionally tracing the embossed lettering with her fingers. "Do you think they meant it, Dad?" she asked softly, referring to the standing ovation and the apologies. Michael, looking out at the horizon, chose his words carefully. "I think some did, and some might still be learning. But what matters is that you stood up, you didn't give up, and now they can't pretend not to see you anymore." Ava leaned against him, and together they watched as the city slowly lit up, one building at a time. Though Michael knew the journey ahead would still hold challenges, he also knew that the hardest part, the silence, the invisibility, the quiet acceptance of injustice, had been broken. Ava had endured the storm and emerged not just as a survivor, but as a beacon for others. And in that quiet moment, As father and daughter sat watching the city come to life, Michael felt, perhaps for the first time, that they had truly won. Not just against a school, but against the silence itself. In the weeks following the graduation ceremony, Michael moved with the same precision that had marked every decisive moment of his life, but now with a deeper, more personal resolve. The school, still grappling with the repercussions of the public exposure, entered a period of cautious transition. Media attention remained constant, and community pressure forced the board to remain under scrutiny. However, Michael was already looking beyond the immediate aftermath. His mind was now consumed by a larger purpose, not just healing the wounds inflicted upon Ava, but preventing them from ever reopening for others. Michael quietly began assembling a team composed of educators, legal experts, civil rights advocates, child psychologists, and fellow parents who had experienced similar struggles. He explained to them the core idea he had been refining since the night of Ava's confession: a foundation, fully independent, dedicated to combating systemic discrimination in schools and supporting students who suffered from bullying and exclusion due to race, ethnicity, or any form of difference. He poured his own fortune into the project without hesitation, securing the best resources, hiring professionals with proven track records, and ensuring that the foundation would be equipped to operate not just locally, but nationwide. For Michael, this was not charity, it was responsibility. He named it the Ava Johnson Foundation, both as a tribute to his daughter's resilience and as a constant reminder of what was at stake. News of the foundation's creation spread rapidly. The same media outlets that had followed the scandal now covered Michael's initiative with intense interest. Interviews, editorials, and public endorsements from influential figures flooded, turning Ava's story into a symbol of resistance and transformation. Schools across the country, some genuinely seeking change and others driven by fear of similar exposure, reached out to the foundation for guidance. But Michael had made it clear from the start, the foundation was not a mere consultancy. Its mission was to challenge, educate, and reform with uncompromising standards. It would provide legal support for families facing discrimination, conduct independent audits in institutions suspected of fostering hostile environments, and implement educational programs designed to teach students and faculty alike about diversity, empathy, and justice. Moreover, it would amplify the voices of students who, like Ava, had been forced into silence. Within Ava's school, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Under pressure from the community, and now directly influenced by the foundation's work, the board had no choice but to accept the partnership proposed by Michael. Officially, it was presented as a collaboration for educational enrichment, but everyone understood that it was a structural intervention. Michael and his team worked side by side with faculty to design workshops, revise curricula, and establish student-led councils where young voices were given genuine power and influence. Some parents resisted, clinging to outdated views or fearing the loss of their privileged positions within the school's hierarchy. Yet their opposition was met with overwhelming support for the foundation's goals. The majority of the community, awakened by the undeniable evidence and inspired by Ava's courage, stood firmly behind Michael. Teachers who had once felt trapped under the administration's oppressive culture now found themselves free to advocate for meaningful change, supported by clear policies and external oversight. Meanwhile, Ava remained at the center of these transformations, though not in the way Michael initially feared. Instead of becoming a symbol of pity, she became a source of inspiration. Students approached her not out of obligation, but out of admiration and genuine curiosity. They listened when she spoke during newly established student forums, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Slowly, Ava began to reclaim her space, not just as a student, but as someone whose voice mattered. Michael remained vigilant throughout the process, understanding that structural change was not achieved overnight. He ensured that the foundation monitored the school's progress continuously, holding administrators accountable and offering families a channel for transparent communication. He also expanded the foundation's reach beyond Ava's school, establishing pilot programs in other institutions across New York and later throughout the country. Each case brought new stories of children like Ava, children who had hidden their pain behind forced smiles and silence. The foundation became a beacon for these students and their families, offering not just legal and educational support, but hope. Michael was present at every milestone, sometimes speaking publicly, other times working silently behind the scenes. His past life, defined by business success and financial growth, now seemed trivial compared to the profound impact he was witnessing. At home, Ava gradually blossomed. The drawings on the apartment's walls became brighter, filled with images of smiling faces, trees in full bloom, and most notably, groups of children standing together. Her laughter returned, not the cautious chuckle of someone testing the safety of their surroundings, but the unrestrained joy of a child who felt seen and valued. Michael watched with quiet pride as Ava's strength, once hidden beneath layers of pain, now radiated openly. Despite the profound changes unfolding, Michael never sought credit. He declined awards, avoided personal interviews, focused solely on his role, and redirected attention to the foundation and, most importantly, to Ava. His only desire was that no child would endure what his daughter had endured in silence. As the first semester under the new policies ended, the school hosted a modest gathering. Not a gala, but a simple community event where students and families could reflect on the journey they had shared. During the event, Ava, standing next to Michael, was approached by younger students who shyly thanked her for making things better. Michael watched as Ava responded with grace and kindness, no longer the timid girl haunted by the cruelty of her peers, but a leader, however, reluctant, who had inspired real change. Michael knew there was still work to be done. Prejudice, ignorance, and fear could not be erased by policies alone. Yet as he stood amid a crowd no longer marked by forced smiles, but by genuine connection, he realized that they had crossed the most crucial threshold. The silence had been broken, not just in Ava's school, but in every place touched by the Foundation's work. And in the face of that silence, Ava had taught them all how to listen. As months turned into a full academic year, the school that once symbolized indifference had undergone a transformation that no one, not even Michael, could have fully anticipated. What began as reluctant adjustments imposed by external pressure gradually evolved into a genuine cultural shift. The once rigid corridors, marked by whispered exclusions and silent glances, now buzzed with a cautious but steady current of openness and empathy. Michael monitored every step of this transformation without loosening his vigilance. The Ava Johnson Foundation maintained a permanent presence within the school, facilitating workshops, counseling, and an independent grievance process that bypassed the flawed internal mechanisms previously used to silence complaints. Every complaint, however minor or serious, was now logged transparently, investigated promptly, and resolved with direct input from students and families. For the first time in its history, the institution was held to a standard beyond its own insular traditions. More importantly, the children themselves became agents of this change. Under the guidance of the Foundation's Youth Council initiative, Ava and her classmates were empowered to lead forums, organize peer support groups, and implement community projects aimed at fostering inclusion. Michael observed how students, even those who had once been part of the culture of exclusion, began to open themselves to perspectives they had never been challenged to consider before. Children who had previously whispered cruel jokes now sat beside Ava in group discussions, listening attentively, sometimes tearfully, as classmates shared their own stories of feeling invisible. Faculty dynamics shifted as well. Teachers who had once feared repercussions for speaking out now took active roles in fostering an environment of safety and belonging. Training sessions went beyond theoretical lectures and were shaped by personal testimonies, case studies, and community-driven dialogue. Teachers who once dismissed complaints as exaggerations began to understand the depth of the harm caused. More importantly, they learned how to recognize, prevent, and address it. Michael knew, however, that not all resistance had disappeared. Some parents remained defiant, privately lamenting the new atmosphere they accused of diluting the school's prestige. Yet their voices grew quieter as the majority embraced the change, inspired by tangible improvements in students' well-being, academic engagement, and overall community harmony. Michael carefully ensured that these dissenting voices could not derail the progress made, standing firm against any attempt to revert to the old ways. At home, the most profound evidence of transformation was reflected in Ava herself. Freed from the weight of constant fear, she rediscovered parts of her childhood that had been stolen from her. Her laughter, once hesitant and fleeting, became spontaneous and frequent. Her art, once marked by somber palettes and lonely figures, now exploded with color, depicting vibrant scenes of community, friendship, and belonging. She even began inviting friends over, children who had previously been mere acquaintances, but now shared genuine bonds with her. Michael watched these moments unfold with a quiet, guarded relief. Though nothing could erase the pain Ava had endured, he saw how she reclaimed her voice and space, not only as a survivor, but as a catalyst for healing and change. Their home, once a sanctuary against an indifferent world, became a place where Ava could proudly share stories of school projects, peer collaborations, and plans for future initiatives with the foundation. Beyond the school's gates, the impact of the Ava Johnson Foundation extended far beyond what Michael had initially envisioned. Requests for support poured in from schools across the country. Parents and educators who had remained silent for too long now found the courage to speak up, knowing there was an organization ready to stand beside them. The foundation's influence spread organically, driven by necessity and hope, becoming a national platform for children who had too often gone unheard. Michael traveled frequently, meeting with school boards, speaking at conferences, and facilitating programs in communities grappling with similar challenges. Yet, no matter how far his efforts extended, he always returned home in time to share dinner with Ava, to listen to her day and to reassure her without words that she was the reason behind it all. He ensured that, despite the magnitude of their mission, Ava remained a child first, one who laughed, played, and dreamed without fear. With each passing month, Michael noticed that the narrative surrounding Ava's school shifted from scandal to example. Other institutions, inspired by the visible and documented improvements, sought to adopt similar models. Michael had no illusions. He knew that lasting change was complex, often met with hidden resistance and slow to take root. Yet he also knew that they had planted something irreversible, not just policies, but a mindset, a refusal to accept silence as the cost of belonging. The annual school community fair arrived as a symbolic marker of this shift. Unlike previous years, the event was planned entirely by students, under the guidance of the Foundation's Student Council. The themes focused on diversity, resilience, and unity. Ava, shy but determined, volunteered to lead an art project that invited every student to contribute a piece representing their story. The result was a mural composed of hundreds of individual tiles, each telling a fragment of a collective narrative that, when assembled, formed a tapestry of vibrant colors, cultures, and shared experiences. When the mural was unveiled, parents, teachers, and students stood in silence, not out of discomfort but out of awe. Ava stood before it, surrounded by classmates who cheered not out of obligation but genuine pride. Michael, standing discreetly in the crowd, watched as his daughter, once isolated and broken, now stood at the heart of a community she had helped rebuild. For Michael, this moment was more than symbolic. It was proof that change, though painful and slow, was not only possible but transformative. The institution that once silenced his daughter now displayed her art as its emblem of renewal. And while Michael knew there would always be challenges ahead, he also knew that Ava had shown them all how to stand, how to speak, and how to create a world where no child would have to hide again. The seed had been planted, the roots had taken hold. And for the first time in a long while, Michael allowed himself to believe, not just in justice, but in hope. The final months of the academic year unfolded under a different light. What had once been a school cloaked in silence and denial now brimmed with cautious optimism and a genuine sense of renewal. The Ava Johnson Foundation had not only influenced policies, but had reshaped mindsets, forcing both students and adults to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to change. Yet, Michael knew that the ultimate test of transformation was not found in documents or board resolutions, but in the lived experiences of the children walking the hallways each day. As the last days of the semester approached, the school prepared for a new event, one that had never existed before, the Courage and Resilience Assembly. It was designed by the Student Council under the Foundation's guidance, aiming to celebrate those who had shown strength, empathy, and leadership throughout the year. Unlike the traditional ceremonies marked by polished speeches and generic awards, this one was meant to be personal, heartfelt, and led entirely by students. Michael received the invitation with mixed emotions. Part of him worried about how Ava would feel being thrust once more into the spotlight. Yet, when he gently asked her if she wanted to attend, Ava surprised him. She smiled, a soft but confident expression, and said, "Yes, I think I do." Michael saw in her eyes not the fear that once shadowed them, but a quiet pride, a readiness to face whatever the day would bring. The auditorium was filled to capacity. Families, teachers, students, and even former staff who had resigned during the turmoil returned to witness what many described as a new chapter for the school. The stage, usually adorned with the institution's crest, now displayed the vibrant mural created by the students, a mosaic of their stories, their struggles, and their hopes. The assembly began with performances, not of perfection but of authenticity. Students read poems about their journeys, shared stories of moments when they felt unseen, and expressed how they had learned to stand beside one another. Teachers spoke of their own realizations, admitting with humility how blind they had been to the harm perpetuated under their watch. Michael watched, deeply moved, as one by one voices that had been silenced now echoed freely through the hall. Then came the closing moment. Without prior announcement, Ava's name was called. She looked momentarily startled, but, catching her father's reassuring nod, rose from her seat and made her way to the stage. There, the interim principal, accompanied by the student council, presented Ava with a small handcrafted sculpture, a tree with deep roots and branches reaching upward, symbolizing growth, resilience, and unity. The award was not official, not part of any curriculum or institutional protocol. It was a gift from the students themselves. The auditorium stood in applause, not as a spectacle, but as a sincere tribute. Ava, holding the sculpture, stood before them, not as the girl who had once hidden behind curtains, but as the child who had, through quiet courage, changed an entire community. Michael felt his throat tighten as he watched her glance across the crowd, making eye contact with classmates, teachers, and parents who now saw her fully, not as a token, not as a victim, but as Ava. Ava stepped up to the microphone, surprising even Michael. She spoke softly but with unmistakable clarity. "I didn't want to be brave," she began. "I just wanted to be me." Her words, simple yet profound, resonated with every person in the room. "But I learned that sometimes being yourself is already brave enough, and I'm glad I wasn't alone." Tears filled many eyes, including Michael's, as Ava returned to her seat, the applause following her like a warm embrace. In that moment, Michael felt a wave of emotions he could hardly contain: pride, relief, and above all, gratitude. Not just for Ava's courage, but for the countless small acts of bravery that had followed, from students who spoke up for their peers to teachers who refused to look away. As the ceremony ended, families gathered in the courtyard. Conversations flowed not with superficial pleasantries, but with meaningful exchanges. Parents who had once remained silent now spoke openly about how the school had changed their perspective. Teachers shared stories of how they were learning alongside their students. Michael moved quietly through the crowd, accepting handshakes, embraces, and heartfelt words, though he always redirected the praise toward Ava and the collective effort of the community. Later that night back home, Michael and Ava sat on their balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the evening sky. Ava placed the sculpture on the table between them, tracing its branches with her fingertips. "Do you think it'll stay like this?" she asked, referring to the changes at school. Michael, gazing out at the horizon, answered with the wisdom of someone who knew the complexities of the world. "It might not be perfect, and it might not be easy, but it will never be the way it was. And that's because of you." Ava leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. In that quiet, intimate moment, surrounded by the vast city that had once seemed so indifferent, Michael knew that they had done more than fight back. They had built something lasting, not just policies or foundations, but a legacy of courage, truth, and love. And as the wind carried the soft hum of the city's heartbeat into the night, Michael whispered a silent promise to himself and to Ava, that no matter where life would lead them next, they would carry this story, this victory, and this unbreakable bond with them forever. As the last light dimmed and the city embraced the night, Michael knew they had truly changed the world, starting with their own.